Hi everybody, this is a presentation of white paper number 17 on church planting. The first thing I want to talk about is what I would call the specificity, flexibility tension when it comes to speaking to church planters about how to go about church planting. The specificity, flexibility principle. What I mean is this: Redeemer City to City is not a program-driven ministry. In other words, we do not have a kind of set way that everybody plants churches no matter where you are in the world, that you just, here it is, turnkey, these 8 steps and that kind of thing. No, we don't do that. We're all on contextualization. We're helping national leaders to start churches in their own countries, and so we do not dictate those things. So there's huge flexibility. We are a DNA-driven ministry. We say, here's the DNA, which we've been talking about in all these papers, and we don't tell people exactly how they have to plant churches. And yet, church planters who are getting started would love to have some specific ideas. Well, how do you even begin? Or what are the different ways? And so the trouble, of course, in that situation is as soon as we, city to city, start giving people specific examples of how to plant churches, then it can sound like we're saying this is how you must do it in your country or in your context. And so there needs to be a balance in which, and I'm hoping to strike it right here and now, is say, we're going to give you some specific ideas about how to plant churches. We're going to base that on models that we've seen in other parts of the world. And yet, in the end, these are not requirements. There's got to be a great deal of flexibility. The genius, I think, of City to City was a group of people working to come up with innovative new models that really fit the time and the place. And so, specificity, flexibility. I'm going to give you specific ideas, but there's a great deal of flexibility. Okay. Number 2, why do we plant churches? In the paper, I'll just say 2 things that it would be helpful to keep in mind. The 2 things are, first of all, it's biblical. It's a biblical pattern. You see it in the New Testament, that Paul didn't just convert people and then leave, but he organized people into congregations with elders and with officers. And so you might call it the Pauline pattern. Is a very, very important biblical model. The book of Acts, and not just the book of Acts, but the rest of the New Testament, clearly shows that converts were congregated. Converts were not just converted, but they were brought into relationships with each other, and they became bodies, communities, congregations, churches. And so that's the first thing. The second is the reason to do church planting, especially people would say, well, why do church planting in parts of the world where there's already a lot of churches? And the answer to that is because new churches are perhaps the most evangelistically effective way that you can reach people. It is very often said and claimed that new churches are better at reaching new generations and new immigrant groups and new people groups. Secondly, it's often claimed that in general, new churches are better at reaching unchurched, non-Christian people than older churches. And in the paper, we talk a little bit about the fact that that's very common, and ultimately those statements hold up. It is true in general that new churches tend to do a better job of reaching non-believers, and they also do a better job of reaching new groups. But it's also something we point out in the paper, and it's not like newness is a magic bullet. It's not like just being new automatically, that's what happens. It's more like new churches tend to have more missional, outreaching attitudes. They often tend also to locate themselves better, to go to places where there's a lot of unreached people or where there's a lot of mobility and a lot of change. Very often, church planters have an evangelistic heart. So it's not automatic that a new church reaches new people and non-believers better. Nevertheless, in general, that's another reason to start new churches, and that is that it is, frankly, there's less opposition in a new church, brand new church, to reaching out to non-believers than there is in old churches, where very often the members' vested interests reign and rule. Third, there are different kinds of church planters, and I'll mention three that the church planting literature talks about. And depending on your part of the world, you may find one of these three kind of odd, or you don't know, you've not heard of it, but all three exist. I'm going to call them what some other people call them pastoral church planters, catalytic church planters, and apostolic church planters. A pastoral church planter, which is, at least in North America, tends to be the what most people consider the only model. A pastoral church planter is a person who comes very often on the pastor's own, not in the team, and plants the church and then stays as the permanent pastor. A catalytic church planter is someone who comes very often with a team, starts a church, and when the church grows to a certain spot, leaves the church to start a daughter church, very often with part of the team. And so catalytic church planters move more rapidly, and they move from place to place, and they don't just start the church and then grow the church, they start the church and then give it to someone else to grow. And finally, you have apostolic church planters, and these are people who very often start a church, and as the church grows, they make they stay there, but they make that particular church a major hub for church planting. And very often that the church gives the apostolic church planter a lot of time to spend training all the other leaders and getting out to other churches. And the apostolic church planter is really seen as a movement leader, but stays home at the church. So those are the three. Read about them: pastoral, catalytic, apostolic. You say, well, which is the right one, or how do we do? It depends, on a lot of things. It depends on how affluent or poor the communities are. It depends a great deal on the gift mix of the church planters. So it depends on many, many things. Fourth, and this is a very big one, what are the traits or the characteristics of church planters? In other words, if you're trying to assess whether you should plant a church, or if you're trying to assess whether somebody else should plant a church, what are the characteristics you ought to be looking for? In the paper, I do an awful lot of, a lot of throat clearing, because it's very important that, it's more important for the church planter in some ways to have the gifts that every Christian ought to have, the character. They ought to be extremely spiritually mature. They ought to know the Bible. I mean, to a great degree, it is, well, I shouldn't say to a great degree. It is simply the case that a lot of people forget that what a church planter needs is godliness above all, and spiritual maturity above all. And in a sense, the church planter needs to be great at being a Christian and just great at being a minister. But then, are there some things that are, you might say, specific to church planters that they need if they're going to plant churches? And even though I'm going to give you a caveat, because the last thing I'm going to talk to you about in a minute is two basic models of church planting, and to some degree the gifts depend on which model you're using. Nevertheless, I would say this: first of all, largely, by and large speaking, church planters need to be somewhat entrepreneurial. There's an awful lot of research that's gone into what makes a person entrepreneurial. They like risk. They like innovation. They're self-starters. They like starting new things. And in that sense, generally speaking, church planters should have some of those entrepreneurial gifts, some of those entrepreneurial traits that other entrepreneurs have. Church planters either ought to have unusually good evangelistic gifts and or unusually good speaking gifts. But we'll talk to you, it depends on the model you're using. But they ought to be really, really good at attracting outsiders, either through their personal evangelism or through their speaking. And then finally, they need to love the people they're going to and fit the people they're going to. That doesn't mean they have to be identical. If they have a real affinity for the people And if they really love them and they just know how to work with the people they're going to, that's crucial. That's kind of cultural adaptivity. So entrepreneurship, cultural adaptivity, the ability to reach new people, either through your speaking gifts or your evangelistic gifts. But that leads me to my the last thing I want to talk to you about. There are a lot of models of church planting, and anybody who reads the literature, they're going to give you all kinds of models. But my experience after many, many decades is that there are, roughly speaking, two models. There's models that they start with a very small number of people, and they basically do lots and lots of evangelism, and they gather a core group very slowly, largely by converting people. And then later on, they go to corporate worship, where they start to have worship celebrations. The other approach is to go to the worship celebration quickly. It usually means you start with a core of more people. You seek to go to the worship celebration more quickly. And then after the worship celebration, you start to evangelize. If you're doing what I would call the church, planting a worship site model, a worship launch model, then the minister probably needs to be a pretty good speaker. If you're doing the pioneer evangelist approach, I think the minister doesn't have to be necessarily as a good speaker, but needs to have real outgoing gifts. Doesn't necessarily have to be a super extrovert, but just has to be really, really good with new people, disarming them, enabling them to really share, and leading people to Christ. So those two models really will determine a great deal about what the traits ought to be for the church planter, and also whether it's going to be a team or it's not going to be a team, and so forth. But that's it. There's a lot more in the white paper than that, but that kind of gives you an overview of the main points. And ultimately, there's nothing more important to City than church planting. And be looking forward to talking to more people about this. Thanks.